Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Capital Planning Commission. And thank you all for coming out tonight and coming to our first meeting on the square guidelines on redevelopment of the FBI site here on Pennsylvania Avenue. And while my name's Elizabeth Miller, and I'm the Director of Physical Planning here at NCPC. And with me is Diane Sullivan. She's our project manager, senior urban planner. And she's going to be actually leading the presentation this evening. I'm going to take care of a few logistics. And first thing I'd like to do is invite everyone to, if you'd like to come up to this area here, even if there's a reserve sign, please do. Everyone seems so far away and so distant. There's also microphones here. And the seats are much more comfortable. But anyway, again, thank you all for coming, and I also want to acknowledge those of you that are joining us via the web. Thank you for joining us as well. We have members here from GSA who are joining us, and also NCPC staff. I would like the NCPC staff, if you would, to raise your hand or stand just so folks know who you are. They're helping out with logistics tonight, and specifically when we go to questions and answers, Sarah and Megan are going to be walking around with microphones, so if you're not at the dais here, please speak into a microphone because we are recording, and we want to make sure we pick up your comments so that those on the web or that are listening online can also hear your questions as well. So tonight is the first of two public meetings that we're going to be holding to obtain your input on what you, the stakeholders, believe is important for us to consider as we begin to develop the square guidelines for the potential redevelopment of the J. Edgar Hoover building here on Pennsylvania Avenue. There will be 4 more opportunities for public input over the coming year, in 2016. There will be another public meeting in addition to the 2 that I've already mentioned. And we will have several commission meetings over the course of the development of the square guidelines. NCPC is working very closely with the General Services Administration as well as the city on this important project. And as you can imagine, this is a very important project both to GSA and the FBI. And because the site lies at the heart of downtown between the Capitol and the White House, and its location on Pennsylvania Avenue, really at the heart of one of our most ceremonial and symbolic streets in the nation, there is very important local and national interest. So we're very happy that you all are here, that you're interested, and we very much look forward to your input this evening and throughout the development of these guidelines. Because this new development will significantly has the potential to significantly enhance the character of the avenue and improve the vibrancy, not only of Pennsylvania Avenue, but downtown as well. And we surely do want to create a truly exceptional pedestrian, mixed-use, dynamic environment. And we think your input, those of you that live, work, and visit this area, is important to helping us craft these guidelines. So our next public meeting on this initial guideline development is on Thursday morning at 9:30, April 28th. We're going to be covering the same material that we're covering this evening. So unless you're really interested, there's no need to come to that meeting as well. But you're welcome to join us if you'd like. We are live streaming this meeting as well as the April 28th meeting. So please be aware that your comments and your questions will be recorded and broadcasted. So that's very important. We are going to be taking notes this evening. So we'll be recording that, and we'll be posting our notes on the website as well. We are going to be taking public comment. If you'd like to leave your comments with us tonight, please do so. There will be a box out in the lobby, so you can drop those off before you leave. We also invite you to submit your comments online. And there's a comment sheet, public comment sheet, that you could have picked up on your way in. And if you don't have it, we'll make sure you get one. That has both our mailing address. You can submit your comments by mail or online, as I said, and that has all the pertinent information that you need to do so. It also has our website where you can find the materials not only for tonight's presentation, but more information about what square guidelines are, and where you can keep up to date on this process. Just a couple of other things. If you need the restrooms, they're outside the lobby door and to the right. Men, you can just go right on in. Your restroom, women, there is a code. Please see the front attendant, and they will get you that code. If those of you sitting up here at the dais have a cell phone, please make sure that it's turned off and it's not near the microphone because it will interfere with our system. And I think that covers all of the major logistics. So again, thanks for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Diane to get us started.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for attending the first public meeting on the development of square guidelines for the J. Edgar Hoover site, currently occupied by the FBI headquarters. As many of you know, GSA is in the process of consolidating the FBI to one of 3 sites outside of the district. In exchange for the new campus, GSA will give the selected developer title to the J. Edgar Hoover site on Pennsylvania Avenue. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is to start the process of developing square guidelines that will inform future development on this site. Part 1 is an overview of the 1974 Pennsylvania Avenue Plan and square guidelines. Then we'll talk a little bit about the process for developing square guidelines, and then dive into what topics should be included in the guidelines, and finally end on an initial discussion on building massing, focusing on build to lines and maximum height of buildings. So first, a quick overview of Pennsylvania Avenue and the plan. We all know that Pennsylvania Avenue is one of the most historic thoroughfares in the world, guided by the L'Enfant and Macmillan plans. It has served many roles over time, from a rural thoroughfare to a bustling entertainment district, to the backdrop of our nation's celebrations and sorrows. And it has also seen a significant amount of revitalization. Over 40 years ago, in 1972, Congress established the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation, PADC, to direct millions of dollars in public and private reinvestment into the street after it had fallen into disrepair. The PADC developed the 1974 Pennsylvania Avenue Plan and square guidelines to carefully restructure the avenue into a place that would balance the needs of the nation and the city. And during this time, at the center of it all, the J. Edgar Hoover building was constructed to house the FBI headquarters. The Hoover building and the site fall squarely in the center of PADC boundary and the avenue itself. You can see square 378 to the north, and then square 379 directly on Pennsylvania Avenue. While PADC was dissolved in 1996, the plan and related documents are still in effect today and will guide redevelopment of this site. The 1974 plan is the foundational document that includes the goals, objectives, and the development framework for the area. PADC also developed general guidelines which provide uniform standards for development, such as high architectural quality, for example. And finally, PADC developed square guidelines for each square in the PADC boundary. These provide the most guidance for development and are similar to zoning. Interestingly, square guidelines were not developed for squares with federal facilities, so squares 378 and 379 with the Hoover building don't have any. When the plan and square guidelines were created, it was not anticipated that this site would become private in the future. The plan itself simply describes the Hoover building, which was under construction when the plan was created, and envisions the site for federal office use. So in anticipation of the site transitioning to a private use, GSA and NCPC worked with stakeholders this past winter to amend the plan. It now envisions the site as a high-density, mixed-use development, which I'll talk more about as we dive into the topics for square guidelines. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about what square guidelines are in specificity and then also the process for developing them. So by definition, square guidelines are detailed urban planning and design requirements and recommendations which are applicable to each square, and basically they're there to help implement the Pennsylvania Avenue plan. What you see here is a very typical list of topics or criteria that are included in square guidelines. Sometimes they're more detailed, they could include specific master plans, but for the most part, this is more typical of what you find. And it includes things like allowable building height, requirements with regard to roof structures, pedestrian features, curb cuts, guidelines with regard to parking and that sort of thing. I think it's important to understand how the square guidelines are used in the development review process as we think about what should go into them. Square guidelines are created for the site either before or after the site becomes private. In this case, it's happening before. Zoning applies to the site, but it must be consistent with the square guidelines. So zoning can be more detailed, but it has to be consistent with the guidelines. Historic Preservation Review Board and Commission of Fine Arts review processes still apply. And before a building permit is issued, NCPC and GSA review the development plan for consistency with the square guidelines. So that gives you a sense of how important it is to make sure that federal and local interests are protected in these guidelines. So here we are this week, April 26th and 28th. As Elizabeth said, we're having the same meeting twice, so people can, just so that people can attend. What we'd like to do, and we'll be talking largely about topics in square guidelines today, what we would like to do is go to our commission this June with a very high-level proposal of the different topics we think we'll include in the square guidelines, and then also a high-level concept for building massing. And then throughout the summer, we'll be working with stakeholders to develop a more complete draft of the square guidelines. We'll do an information presentation. It's the Commission of Fine Arts. We'll hold another public meeting, and then we plan on coming back to our commission here later in the fall with that draft concept, and then we'll come back one more time, likely at the end of the year, with a final version. So there really are 4 more opportunities for public input on these guidelines. And then in terms of the larger picture, there are other processes underway this year that are relevant to the development of square guidelines. Federal agencies and other stakeholders are working through the Section 106 process to ensure this project does not have an adverse effect on historic resources such as the Pennsylvania Avenue Historic District. GSA will be issuing the final environmental impact statement later this fall. And lastly, NCPC is leading the Pennsylvania Avenue Initiative, which is an effort to update or prepare a new plan for the avenue. While this project is still in the early stages and won't be complete until after the square guidelines are developed, we're preparing a market study and urban design analysis for the avenue that can help to inform our work for the guidelines, so that will be informative. We anticipate briefing our commission and the public on this effort also towards the end of 2016. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause there for a minute. Are there any questions about process in terms of either developing square guidelines, where they fit into the development review schedule, the development review process itself, before I move into the substantive part? No?
Yeah, but go back here.
Okay, all right. All right, great. Well, we'll just keep rolling. All right, part 3. So what should be included in the square guidelines for the Hoover site? As we consider different topics, I think it's important to recognize that these guidelines, as I mentioned, are being developed before a development team is on board and far in advance of when development is actually going to happen on this site. So these will not be so specific that there's going to be a specific development program or parcelization plan for this site, because we just a lot can happen between now and the time the site is actually developed. That said, this is our opportunity to shape development to meet local and federal interests, so there are many topic areas that I think should be considered for the square guidelines. So we saw an example earlier of what typically is included in the square guidelines, and we really would like your input on what we should include for squares 378 and 379. We've listed the topics here that we think should be addressed in various levels of detail. Some may be more specific, some may be pretty general. And they include land use, building massing, circulation, some special design guidance and public realm guidance, and then sustainability. And I'll walk through some of these now and talk a little bit about what the plan amendment said and opportunities to provide additional guidance. So the first is land use, and actually the plan amendment actually addresses land use in a decent amount of detail. It calls for accommodating high-density development with a mix of uses such as commercial, residential, and cultural uses. It calls for complementing that new development complement and enhance all of the surrounding downtown blocks. and that ground floor uses are designed on Pennsylvania Avenue to accommodate and encourage everyday activities, commerce, and public uses. And so we have an opportunity in the guidelines to provide more direction if we think it's necessary. While a specific land use mix for the site will be difficult to determine at this time, as I mentioned before, the guidelines could emphasize desired land uses or ground floor uses on Pennsylvania Avenue, for example. Okay, so the next topic area is building massing. This means the overall shape of the building in terms, or of the development in terms of volume. The plan amendment has a clear vision for high-density development and states that building massing and articulation should befit its location, meaning new development should look to its surroundings. Two components of building massing are height and upper story setbacks. These contribute to protecting view sheds, creating a consistent building wall along a street, and establishing a scale that is comfortable for a pedestrian. Interestingly, the Hoover building sits at a transition point for the avenue. Buildings to the west are largely around 160 feet. The Hoover building itself sets back to about 160 feet at its highest point. And then Market Square starts to taper down a little bit at 140, and so do the other buildings as you get closer to the Capitol. Build-to lines, sometimes referred to as setbacks, indicate the line at which construction of the building facade can occur on a lot. For example, the current build-to line for the Hoover building is 75 feet from the curb of Pennsylvania Avenue. Build-to lines are important because they can have an impact on view sheds, the building wall along a street, and the character of the space in front of the building, in addition to the overall developable area of the site. The plan amendment calls for redevelopment to respect the principles of the L'Enfant Plan by restoring views, provide and contribute, new development should provide and contribute to the avenue's distinguished character, and strengthen the vista of the U.S. Capitol. Given the broad guidance in the plan amendment, there is an opportunity to look at the site's build-to lines and the square guidelines in more detail, and we'll actually look a little bit at that in the next section of the presentation. Circulation is an important concept for a site this large. You'll notice that a single FBI building is comparable to the three buildings to the east. The plan amendment calls for redevelopment to respect the principles of the L'Enfant Plan by restoring circulation patterns. Here's a historic photo that shows squares 378 and 379 in accordance with the L'Enfant Plan. D Street continued through the Hoover site, shown in yellow here, across 10th Street until it eventually ran into Pennsylvania Avenue. And this is where D Street ends today. This is an opportunity, there's an opportunity in the square guidelines to acknowledge whether the spatial configuration of D Street, whether it's a dedicated right-of-way or not, is desirable and appropriate to reintroduce into the site. And there's also the opportunity to discuss additional circulation throughout the site. And then with regard to special design guidelines, the plan amendment does not go into any specific level of detail, but we could, if desired through the square guidelines, address things like facade design, building composition, appropriate signage and awnings, location of rooftop structures, and parking and loading for the site. Although I will say, especially with like parking and loading, some of that will be, that would not be in a very specific level of detail just because we will not have a parcelization plan. But there are general guidelines that we could move forward. And then with regard to public realm, there are guidelines that we could present related to ground floor design, landscape, outdoor uses, and character, all of which again influence the character and quality of the streets surrounding the site. So with that brief overview, I'd like to stop and take a moment to see if there's any questions about the topics we're considering for the square guidelines. These are, again, fairly typical of what comprise most of the guidelines for the squares within the PADC boundary. There have been a few cases where much more specific guidelines have been developed, but I think in this case, given the timing of which we're developing these square guidelines, that this is probably close to an appropriate a number of topic areas for us to address. And I think one of the questions that we have for folks is, are there other things that we're missing here? We will have a lot of opportunity in the future to talk about level of detail, but right now we're just trying to hone in on the actual topics themselves. So as you're sitting here in the darkness, I will ask you all very uncomfortably if anyone has any comments on topic areas. If I turn the lights on, would you be more willing to speak? No. Okay, well then I'm going to keep moving forward. Or no? Okay. So then the last, and now actually we can probably just wait and go through the whole presentation and maybe have comments then. The last part of the discussion is on building massing, and there's sort of two subparts to this. There's a part on build two lines and then also on overall height. So we've already spent some time discussing build two lines. They're an important concept because where a building sits on a street in relation to other buildings can positively or negatively impact view sheds, the overall building wall of the street, the height of buildings, and again, the developable area of the site. Take, for instance, this view of the Capitol in terms of talking about view sheds. If you were to move the buildings forward, they could, depending on their height, start to narrow the view of the Capitol. However, you could also lower the initial building heights, and then that view would be preserved. So there's sort of a balancing act that I think we need to look at. The build to line also affects the area in front of the building and what you can accommodate in the space, such as a single, double, or triple row of trees, pedestrian movement, or space for outdoor activity. And it can also reduce or increase the amount of space you have for development. So there are three challenges for determining the Pennsylvania Avenue build to line for this site. The first one is that the dimensions of Pennsylvania Avenue have changed over the years, and the build to lines are no longer consistent from block to block. The second challenge is the build to lines. The build to line has impacts for both avenue as a whole and also for the site, and both of these need to be considered. And the third challenge is that we will need to establish guidance on a build to line before having all the answers regarding a special development proposal for the site and recommendations for the entire avenue from the Pennsylvania Avenue Initiative. So with those challenges, we move forward. Let's take a quick look at how the avenue has changed over time. This is actually really quite interesting. In 1791, L'Enfant designed the avenue as a direct and large avenue with a walk on each side planted with double rows of trees. So he put 80 feet in the middle for carriages and then 40 feet on each side and double rows of trees. This, however, was never implemented. Instead, Jefferson spent 1/4 of the city's improvement budget in 1803 to plant 4 rows of fast-growing poplars, the full distance of Pennsylvania Avenue. Still 160 feet wide, just like all of our great avenues, but this was what the section of the street looked like. And it had multiple carriageways. Then by 1901, the Macmillan Plan proposed the Federal Triangle, and the Pennsylvania Avenue had changed once again. This time the cartway was widened to about 107 feet, and the sidewalks were reduced, accommodating now just a single row of trees. And then fast forward to 1974, the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation altered the street one more time. It was determined that the larger cartway needed to remain because at this time we had a lot of traffic using the site. It wasn't, there was definitely a lot of traffic on the street, so they decided to keep the larger cartway. And it was decided though that the sidewalk areas were too small, so PADC under the PADC plan went in and widened the avenue on the north side, adding an additional 50 feet to the already 25 feet for sites that we're going to redevelop. So you have a 75-foot build to line and proposed 3 rows of trees. And then they also widened the avenue on the south side, but only by a couple of feet, and you now have 2 rows of trees on the south side. And that's pretty much what remains today. And so you can look at the conditions here. We've simplified it a bit, but the area in dark green represents where the build to line is 75 feet from the curb, largely on the north side of the street. The light green is around 45 to 50, and the red shows largely where the historic buildings are, around 25, 30 feet or less. Now, while it varies, a significant portion of the build-to lines on the avenue, I think you can see, are at least 45 feet from the curb. And of course, the rows of trees increases with the larger build-to line. Okay, so first, let's look at what it would mean to reestablish the L'Enfant plan on the Hoover site, which is a very important policy for both NCPC and the district to reestablish the L'Enfant plan. Under the changed conditions of Pennsylvania Avenue, this would mean that the development on the Hoover site will move forward to 30 feet from the curb. This presents some benefits and some drawbacks. This is an area of the avenue where the build-to line is around 30 feet. The benefits are that I think is that it allows for more development, and I think most people would argue that density on the north side of the street is definitely needed to better activate the street. Moving the build-to line forward also makes the building wall a more prominent element of the street, and I think some would argue that that's a positive thing as well. Here's another example. In some ways, it's a very urban and intimate experience. The drawbacks, however, is that only a single row of trees can be planted, and there isn't much space for outdoor activity, and sometimes actually can be even a little crowded depending on how many people are out and about. Now, a more typical condition, especially on the south side of Pennsylvania Avenue, is the build-to line around 45 to 50 feet. This accommodates the double row of trees that L'Enfant envisioned and space for outdoor activity if desired. And here's an example of what that looks like. This is from the building face to the curb. That's about around 50 feet. And then there's the current condition, the current situation in front of the Hoover building where the build-to line is 75 feet. This is the same, actually, as also the block to the west of the Hoover building. Now, most would argue that this space doesn't work at all. Is it because there are no ground floor uses, no street furnishings, or is it simply too much space to ever be successful? This image is also a good example of how the build-to lines on the avenue don't align. You can see Market Square actually extending forward pretty close to the curb. It comes out to about 35 feet from the curb. I think that's really interesting. So let's look now at how moving the build-to line changes the wall of buildings along the avenue and how it changes the pedestrian experience. We'll talk about how the build-to line and height can change views of the Capitol in the next section. So here we are standing in the center of Pennsylvania Avenue looking towards the Capitol. You can see the FBI building right there. And now we're just going to turn this into a modeling image. So same thing. Looking towards the Capitol. So here you have the historic Evening Star building that it comes up very close, well, pretty close. I mean, it comes up to about 25 to 30 feet from the curb. Then it widens again at 1001 Pennsylvania. You have, actually, this is where you have the 3 rows of trees. This is 75 feet from the curb. And this is where Central and Taddage Grill are and have their outdoor seating. Then you have FBI, and then you have Market Square, which comes up to the corner, close to about 35 feet from the curb, and then it opens up again. I think opens up again to the Navy Archives area and all the restaurants there. And I think one of the very interesting considerations here is that, and that we've been grappling with, is that this notion of, do you want retail and restaurants to activate the street? And I think it's a really good question to ask whether, one, if that's possible for this entire street, if it's more appropriate to maybe have it clustered. So have it clustered on the 1001 Pennsylvania block, not on the Hoover site, and then have it again at the archives area. Would it be more successful that way? All right, so what we're going to do now, looking at the building wall changing and moving forward, is I'm going to actually fast forward here, and I'm going to move the FBI. We just used the massing of the FBI building as an example here. So it's 108 feet tall at its initial height. We're going to move it forward 50 feet. Okay. Not that noticeably different. You can still see Market Square. It sort of sits in between Market Square and 1001 Pennsylvania Avenue now. And this is actually, that 50-foot build-to line is now in line with the Department of Justice across the street, also with a 50-foot build-to line. Now let's move it forward to 30 feet from the curb, which would be the dimensions of the l'enfant plan. And you really can't see much of Market Square anymore. And I mean, there's some benefits and drawbacks here. It actually in some ways starts to enclose the space in front of 1001 Pennsylvania Avenue, but it also definitely appears to be sticking out a little bit more. You could no longer accommodate a double or triple row of trees at this build-to line. It would have to be a single row of trees and look more like the condition in front of Evening Star. And so now we'll just do this looking from the other direction, and I can probably go through these a little bit faster. So you see the FBI building. And now Market Square is in the foreground and 1001 in the background. This is still the existing condition, 75 feet from the curb. And if we move it forward, moving the build-to line to 50 feet places the building in between that of 1001 and Market Square. And then when you move it forward again, you can no longer see 1001 Pennsylvania. And from this perspective, it appears that Market Square and FBI are sort of in line with one another. But actually, the FBI building would be coming out an additional 5 feet from where Market Square is. So the last thing I wanted to convey about the build-to line is the development plan for the site itself. And this is also really important. So we've just looked at sort of impacts to the avenue, but I think we also have to look at what it means for the site. Now let's assume the spatial configuration of D Street is required. There are many different ways in which squares 378 and 379 can be designed. The development project could focus activity and public space in the interior of the site, similar to what City Center does. Or it could focus that activity on the exterior, such as on Pennsylvania Avenue and E Street. If you focused it on the interior, that might argue for less of a smaller build-to line on Pennsylvania Avenue. But if you focused it on the exterior, then you might argue for a little more space along the avenue itself. And these are the types of questions we're considering as we develop guidelines for the site. So I've presented, obviously, several considerations here, and some of the questions that we have and really would like to hear from you either here tonight or over the next couple of weeks in terms of the pedestrian experience on Pennsylvania Avenue. What elements are important? Should these elements be consistent along the avenue, or is it okay for variation? Example, retail, restaurants, trees, that sort of thing. What do you see as the benefit and drawbacks to the different build-to lines for the Hoover site? And third, is there any additional analysis that, or other information that you think would be beneficial to determining the Pennsylvania Avenue build-to line for this site? So unless there's any burning, are there any comments? I would love,
I
yes.
have a couple of comments.
Okay.
Just so people don't know, I
Oh.
used to work at Pennsylvania Avenue Development
Joe.
Corporation, so I'm supposed to turn this on.
Sorry. Stay red. There we go. Hi, my name is Joanne Newhouse. I used to work at the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation, so I'm sure they knew I would speak. So I just want to go over a couple of things. First of all, the urban design of the avenue is very critical and was critical to in how its creation. A lot of the setback area had to do with two earlier plans that weren't mentioned, which were done as executive council and a committee, and they set the standard for having the 75-foot setback. And in those days, which were the super block days, they were set back entirely along the avenue on the north side. So the 75-foot setback, or 50 feet from the 25-foot wide sidewalk now, really pre-existed the Pennsylvania Avenue plan, but it did create a definite vista. Now, historic preservation became much more important, and so the plan required the preservation of a number of buildings, and the only buildings that really popped out were the historic buildings, except in certain locations, and those locations were where L'Enfant had planned a square, and that was where Market Square is. There was supposed to be a cutout there, which is why the archives isn't on the axis for the avenue, but is turned. The post office building, that was an anomaly. It wasn't supposed to be like that, but it was an important building. It was kept, and we were very happy it was kept. So I just want to mention the importance of urban design of the entire avenue so that when you think of setbacks, you take that into consideration. The other thing is that it's ironic that I think the image that you showed of Square 460, if I've got it right, which is the there's nothing there to tell you what's there. It's between 6th and 7th Street. It is the deadest block on the avenue, but that's one with a narrow sidewalk. So the width of the sidewalk isn't going to guarantee activity. In fact, you can't tell a developer he has to do something on the ground floor. And that was certainly a frustration that PADC had, because we didn't want banks, we didn't want airline offices, which were very popular. We wanted restaurants, we wanted shops. It's a one-sided retail street. So mainly you are going to get restaurants if you're going to get a kind of activity you want, or you can get sculpture or something. But there's one other little factor that wasn't mentioned. It's called the Inaugural Parade. And so one of the reasons for the 75-foot setback was, why it was 75 feet instead of 50 feet, was to put stands up for the Inaugural Parade. And I don't know how this Inaugural Parade coming up is going to do with the lumps in the street, but my guess is they're going to have to be removed just like the light fixtures are, the traffic signals, because everything has to be just right for the inaugural. So that's another consideration that I just wanted to bring up. The other thing I just wanted to mention, two other things I want to mention. One is that a lot of the guidelines call for basically masonry buildings, because they wanted a complement to the north side, which was the south side with the Federal Triangle, that you didn't want all glass buildings, that there would be some disconnect visually. And good urban design is the urban design you don't recognize. It's there, it's done, but you don't notice it when you're by it. And I think, for me, Carter Brown talked about it in Paris. It's the Rue Royale between the Place de la Concorde, which has the big obelisk in it, and the Madeleine, which is designed like a Greek temple with a big portico, has steps going up. There are only 2 blocks there, but the roof lines are identical. The block closest to the vertical obelisk is here, which is much closer on both sides equally. And the next block is set out here to frame the Madeleine portico. I have been there more times than any city in this country except where I grew up in New York, and I never noticed it until he pointed it out. And that's really good urban design. I think that's one of the things that's important to accomplish here. So I mentioned the masonry because you've already approved a building, and so has Fine Arts, that's a total glass building, which is one of our members, and I shouldn't be saying this, but I am anyway. It's going to replace a masonry building on the block facing Freedom Plaza. And the last thing I wanted to mention was that I believe that the buildings are, the Market Square is 130 foot, not 140 foot height. And maybe with the penthouses it's 140 foot, but all buildings were measured without the penthouses, including the 160 feet. No penthouses were ever allowed on the 160 feet, and you had to have just a little tiny bit so you could stand up. So I think we allowed 10 feet for an exit on the 160-foot height, so that was a fixed height. So that, when you talk about rooftop structures, that sort of concerned me a little bit. And there were none allowed on the lower portion, which is lower because it matches the height of the Federal Triangle cornice line, not because it's actually 135 feet, not 130, if I'm correct. I might have forgotten. But anyway, so those are the masonry and the urban design and the roof were the things that I just wanted to mention. Okay.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you. Anyone else on this section? I do have one more section on height. All right, why don't I finish and then we can open it up for any additional comments. Okay, so this is the final section of the night, and it's actually pretty short on height and upper story setbacks on Pennsylvania Avenue. The 1910 Height Act regulates the maximum allowable height of buildings in DC. Zoning and square guidelines, in this case, can be more restrictive. Let me rephrase that, zoning can be more restrictive, and in this case, square guidelines can be more restrictive, but the maximum is defined by the Height Act. For buildings that front on Pennsylvania Avenue, the maximum height allowed is 160 feet. There are a few different ways per the Height Act where buildings on squares 378 and 379 would be considered to front on Pennsylvania Avenue even if the spatial configuration of D Street is required in the square guidelines. This means that buildings could achieve 160 feet in height on both squares under certain conditions. What we need to determine through the square guidelines is whether this is desirable. So here you can see the existing heights of buildings today. Again, the Hoover building is a transition point to the west. What? I'm still on this side. Okay.
Sorry.
So here, so you can see the FBI building is at around 157. And as I mentioned before, to the west, the buildings are much taller, and then it starts to taper down towards the Capitol. And while several buildings on the north side of the avenue go to almost 160 feet, their initial building height on the avenue shown in yellow is much lower. The FBI starts at about 108 and then sets back to eventually reaching about 160. The Pennsylvania Avenue plan is very clear about these initial building heights on Pennsylvania Avenue being compatible with their surroundings and setting back to 160 feet to protect views of the Capitol. So here you can see the Department of Justice initially rises to 105 and then sets back to 127. And from this perspective, you get a good view of Market Square, which rises to about 102 and steps back to, Joanne, I think we have 140, but that could be the top of the penthouse. I'd have to zoom in to see. So now let's look at the same set of images again, but this time looking at how shifting the build-to line changes the impact of the initial building height. And as we're doing this, consider whether moving the build-to line forward changes the view of the Capitol or the symmetry of the buildings. This gets a little more technical. Okay, so here we are again. This is the same set of images. This time we're looking at the Capitol. And FBI sits in between 1001 Pennsylvania and Market Square. This is the existing setback of the FBI building at 75 feet, and it goes to 108 feet for its initial building height. So now I'm going to move it forward and watch the red. So those two red lines denoting the view from the Capitol are fairly symmetrical. And when you move the building forward, the red line changes, and I left the initial line in there just so you could see how much it changed. It's very faint. It's a little less symmetrical, but it's nuanced. Like it's not that big of a change. But then if you keep the same building height and then move it forward to 30 feet from the curb, that one red line on the left side of the slide starts to be it creates a situation where the two lines are no longer, the views are no longer symmetrical, meaning that the initial heights of the buildings along the avenue, are not creating a symmetrical view. So that was a very quick overview of height, and we're just starting to grapple with some of these issues in terms of the relationship of the build-to line and the initial height on Pennsylvania Avenue. But I think some of the broader questions with regard to tackling that is, given the plan amendment, that the plan amendment envisions the site as a high-density mixed-use development, and that the 1910 Height Act allows a height of up to 160 feet, what should we consider when developing guidelines related to height? How important is symmetry along the avenue? Should this be achieved through the building wall, the tree canopy, both, or none at all? And is there additional analysis or other information with regard to height that you think would be helpful in determining the square guidelines for this site? So I think I'm going to turn the lights on now. Are there any questions? Yes.
My name is Annie Lerma, and
Oh, hold on. Oh, I'm sorry. We need the microphone.
Hello, my name is Annie Verma, and
My question is, I think you've already covered it in point 2. My only comment is that, the urban design study that we've done, if you go to a couple of slides before this, with the building facade coming 50 foot outwards and leaving the 35-foot setback, the only thing missing there, I feel, is the tree line.
Okay.
And if we're able to see what moving the building facade inside or outside does to the tree line, I think that would be very beneficial.
Okay.
My comment is, if, and I'm assuming most people here are concerned about the Capitol Vista, if we're so concerned about the Capitol Vista, we should probably tear down all the stoplights and get rid of car traffic on Pennsylvania Avenue, because in my opinion, that's the ugliest thing about Pennsylvania Avenue.
John Fondersmith. I think, and it's somewhat accidental, of course, with the FBI building the way it is, and then the change that happened with the historic preservation, notably in this case, the Evening Star building, that there is an interesting relationship there for a couple blocks. I mean, it's not the Grand Avenue in a way. It's set off by Market Square on one end, which of course is new, and the Evening Star building facade, which and that's kind of relationship certainly should be considered in developing it. I mean, there was a big change from the original idea of this Grand Avenue in the original Pennsylvania Avenue plans to one that was recognized historic values and historic landmarks. And the other thing I would say is that the relationships to, and I know you've got this in here, to the surrounding blocks, to East Street, to 10th Street, 9th Street. As we all know, the FBI building has just been a deadening effect on not only its square, but outward so there's a great opportunity to position new uses and maybe pedestrian ways, as you talk about, that will relate to that surrounding area.
Hi, my name is Jessica Rosenberg. I live about 2 blocks away at 631 D Street. I am a really big fan of having this not be a dead area. I think sightlines are important. We want our city to remain beautiful because we want people to visit it. We want to be proud of it. But I think the most important thing is that we have a functioning area. And so for me, if I think what would I get excited about in that space, it's not how close to the road the building is. It's if there's a park, because there are like no parks around for kids. If there's a grocery store, because there are no grocery stores. So for me, the biggest thing is just the functionality of the space. Thanks.
Hi, I'm sorry, I forgot one more thing. The reason why the height east of the FBI building is lower, I mean, there's actually a reason for it, because that was the area designated for mixed use with residential. And there was a sense that having a 160-foot height would not convey an ambiance of residential as part of mixed use. Now, we've seen a change in what's happened in this world, in this city, with mixing residential and commercial, and that might not be as much of an issue now, but that was the initial reason why it went to 130-foot height east of the FBI building. So I just want, because you might not have known that, so I thought I would just mention it. I think I wanted to add something to what you said. I think everyone would love all those uses. It's very hard to require them legally. I mean, there was an attempt to get a grocery store down here, and it failed, well, more than one attempt. And it's just, we don't have the density of population living here, even though we are a denser area, than you have, let's say, in Logan Circle. Logan Circle has 14 single-member districts because ANCs are based on residential population. We have 3. And that's also because people who live here often have a second residence. That's their primary residence. So the census doesn't necessarily reflect the actual population here, but it is on what it's based. It's set at 6,000. In 2010, it's about 10,000 because of people who live here during the week or because they're stationed here for a while. But they aren't, it isn't their permanent homes, and that's how that's based. But still, it's not the kind of population you have in Logan Circle, which can support both a Giant and a Whole Foods. And I don't know how you get it here. I wish I did.
Well, you add more housing.
That's certainly one way.
Hello, my name's Annette Smallworth. I actually live in Market Square next door. So just picking up on the lady to my left, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, but I 100% agree. Obviously, it'd be nice for it to be more busy, more bustling. So therefore, I really don't understand the concept of putting the build to line closer to the road. Because to me, Market Square really comes alive with the outdoor cafes and that. And to me, that if it's going to be a mixed-use type environment with cafes and restaurants, you really do need that outdoor space, I think, personally.
Just thinking about the setbacks, one of the heaviest pedestrian trafficked areas in the city is on 7th Street in Chinatown, and it also happens to have some of the narrowest sidewalks. So I don't think that having incredibly wide sidewalks is necessary to having pedestrian life. I think oftentimes it's detrimental, especially on Pennsylvania Avenue, where it's great to have tree coverage, especially on a 90-degree day like today, up into the point you're crossing Pennsylvania Avenue and 100 feet in what essentially becomes a desert. And so if you want to have it be active, you're probably not going to be able to count on pedestrians crossing back and forth, but you might be able to count on activity alongside north or alongside south. I guess not south because of the government buildings there. But we do have an opportunity on the north side of the street. I think that a narrow sidewalk doesn't necessarily kill that activity, especially since you have an entire block to use. To the extent that maybe D Street becomes a pedestrian crossing or a mixed-use crossing for pedestrians and cars, a WUNRF of some sort, then you can possibly have activity in the center as well, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a point where, hey, we have to make it 75 feet back because that's the only way to get people here. It can be closer to the street. You can make D a place for pedestrians as well, and the whole space, like City Center, which actually does have businesses wrapping it as well as on the interior. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
And piggybacking off that comment and responding to your comment, I don't really know. I think that it's kind of, you don't know what you have until it's gone. In the sense that because we have 75 feet of sidewalk, we think we need 75 feet, and taking that away will immediately mean that we don't have any more sidewalk cafes. But then you look at a place like U Street where there are sidewalk cafes. Sure, there aren't as many as Central has in their area, but there is definitely still a possibility to have sidewalk activation and have your sidewalk be 30 feet. When you look at U Street, and in some places the sidewalk is 5 feet, which also you don't want. But I think that because we've become so obsessed with these 75-foot sidewalks on Pennsylvania Avenue, it's hard to imagine them being 30 feet. But 30 feet is still enormous, especially when you have a street as wide as Pennsylvania Avenue.
Sorry, it's Annette again. Just to come back on that, I wasn't necessarily saying it should be 75 feet back, but going back to the other example Joanne mentioned, the 601 block, like you say, that to me is so dead. That's often where I park my car, and it's completely dead there. And going back to 7th Street, why is it so
Because there's no
busy?
retail.
Sorry?
That's because there's no retail in the 600 block, it's
Oh,
Square Capital.
okay, but just going back to 7th Street, one of the reasons it's so busy is because people are crammed on that smaller amount of space just trying to get from A to B. I don't think they're necessarily going there to go into, let's say, Urban Outfitters or whatever, which is just closing down, I think. So essentially, I think people, I mean, I tend to avoid 7th Street because it is so busy trying to get up there, and you can't, as I say, there's no, to me, there's nothing, well, it's all personal opinion, but going back to the original point, I wasn't saying it should be necessarily 75 feet back, but I think there should be space for outdoor entertainment, for want of a better word, you know, so yeah.
Do you think that
yeah.
30 feet is enough?
I think, I'm not sure of the distances, but I think whatever the 601 block is to the east of Market Square, that's, to me, too narrow to have a lot of outdoor entertainment, let's say, but I'm not sure the different distances. But obviously the middle option you gave, I can't remember what it was, seemed to be the, you know, meeting both elements.
Well, so I didn't want to overcomplicate this presentation. To your point, yes, you're right, you can actually fit outdoor cafe space in 30 feet. It's pretty wide. The complicating part on Pennsylvania Avenue is the trees don't sit, on a 30-foot wide sidewalk, you can have cafe space, but the trees really need to be at the curb, and on Pennsylvania Avenue, they start like 6 feet in. So it's a little more difficult. So I think the question is, then do you continue, if you agree to go down to one row of trees, and that's enough to define the tree canopy and the view of the Capitol, then do you push those trees out so they're no longer in a single row down the avenue, and now they're kind of like this? So, but I thought that was a little complicated. I mean, it's getting into details, but these are all really, really, really good points, and definitely things that we're considering right now.
Hi, my name is Annette, and I have 2 units at Market Square West. If you look at the drawing right now, you'll see the big box there blocking Market Square West. It's blocking both of my units. Both of my units overlook Pennsylvania Avenue. In fact, they have some of the best views of Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, I know all of your graphics are shooting towards the Capitol, that your goal is to have a good sightline of the Capitol. I'd also like to see visuals of what my sightline is going to be from my unit looking up the street versus looking down the street.
Okay. Oh, out Pennsylvania.
Down, whichever, the
okay.
opposite direction, yes.
Yeah, we have a few of those in here, and this will be, you'll be able to see this online. You can look at them online too, yes. Any other comment? Oh, yes. Oh, hold on one second. So there's one person behind you, and then you can be next.
So regarding the setbacks, I think 75 is too much, but I also think 30's too little. The 50 seems about right. And then as far as D Street, I wouldn't bring that back for vehicular traffic, but definitely bring that back for pedestrian traffic. And maybe the western tip of Square 379, that could be like a park or plaza or something, and then the building on that eastern half of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bill Klein, I also live in Market Square West. I'm sort of a minority. I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't agree with me, but I've always been in favor of large buildings, maybe up to maximum height, and maybe a public or semi-public roof garden of some kind. In Europe, from time to time, you have activities on the roof like restaurants, and if you build it up to 160 feet, you could put a little phony Italian village on the roof or something that would get people up there. And I came in a little late, so I'm not sure if you really discussed what the actual use of the building is most likely to be. I assume some sort of mixed use, but nobody in this town seems to think of things going on roofs, and we've got some pretty nice views, especially with these even heights where you would be able to see. I always thought city center should have been just 20, 30 feet higher. It wouldn't have blocked anyone's view because they're all commercial, but there's this sacred thing that we don't want tall buildings in this city, but there's a huge footprint here, so if there were something on the roof, you could have an acre of roof garden up there if you wanted to, probably.
Yeah, the amendment that was done for the plan definitely envisions this as very high-density, mixed-use development. And I'm happy to hear, I'm going to take that as a comment pro-height, so I'm happy to, happy to have that comment for sure.
Bill, you know I love you to death. I totally agree with a rooftop build. However, there is the noise ordinance, and so that definitely needs to be considered should there be the a grandiose kind of activity, because again, that would impact my units at Market Square West.
My question's about the symmetrical balance that I think you're looking for in the Vista, and using what has been confused zoning as a guide, as a principle to create that regulating line along that street wall of existing structures that have gone in and out. Seems strange as a planning sense, whereas if you've set the guidelines as time progresses, those guidelines will be consistent, and you'll get that consistent street wall. So to use what has been confused guidelines to create that set this building based on confused guidelines seems odd to me, and I think you might want to rethink that and say, here's an overall plan of what the street wall should be about, and you set this as the building as the precedent to move forward, and eventually you'll see the rest of the buildings, some successful, some not successful, change over time and get to that point.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say is that the larger Pennsylvania Avenue initiative is looking at that very issue, and in some ways it's the timing for the fast-moving FBI project is unfortunate. It once again is sort of leading the way for the revitalization of Pennsylvania Avenue. There is an opportunity. I mean, I can't really speak to when the Hoover site is going to redevelop, but we can do the best job that we can now in developing the square guidelines, and in the future, if the Pennsylvania Avenue initiative decides that the cartway of the street is too big, or, and that you're right, that for the best thing for the street is to move everything in, then there's an opportunity to revisit these guidelines, and maybe the timing will work out because that this is a long-term project for this site. Any other questions? Okay, so we have a little public comment period open through Friday, May 13th. Would love to get comments in by then. We certainly thank you so much for all of your comments this evening. Those will help inform the report that we'll write for our commission in June. I don't know if we'll have established a bill-to line at that point, but it certainly will be helpful in informing some of the overall guidance we will be talking to them about. And then I guarantee that this will be a discussion that we'll be having throughout the summer. And I think it might be easier as the guidelines come together in draft concept to look at everything as a package as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to come talk to me afterwards. If not, thank you so much for coming tonight.